Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well and staying healthy. My name is Tao Bai. I'm from Office of Bioequivalence in Office of Generic Drugs in US FDA. In today's presentation, I'd like to discuss what actions OGD has been taking to quickly react to COVID-19 pandemic and help generic drug industry to cope with various unique challenges caused by COVID-19. I'd like to start my presentation with the disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely from myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of the FDA. In today's presentation, first, I'd like to walk you through all the common generic drug industry challenges due to COVID-19. Then I'll introduce you the OGD COVID-19 approach to help generic drug industry to overcome these challenges. Lastly, I'll talk about the different pathways you may use to submit your questions for your COVID-19 interrupted bioequivalence studies. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has posed many unique challenges to generic drug industry in multiple aspects. In this presentation, I would like to focus on the challenges associated with the bioequivalence study conduct. Based on the different COVID-19 associated rules or guidelines suggested at different time periods, we have seen different types of challenges. For example, at early stage between March and June in 2020, most of countries and regions in the world have imposed lockdown measures. People were under necessary self-quarantines. These challenges may lead to difficulties in meeting the previous specified procedures in the study protocol and cause some unavoidable protocol deviations. It is very important to document the specific information explaining the basis of the missing data, as well as whether the protocol deviation may have any significant impact on the study outcome, and submit all these information in the study report for agencies' review. For example, due to a nationwide lockdown or travel limitation, study subjects may have missed their visits. So in those cases, we have seen some inquiries asking, can I change my sampling scheme and analysis plan to rescue my study? In addition, another common inquiry were received is that my B study is halted due to the pandemic. My test and reference products utilized in the study is going to expire. Can I use expired tests and reference products or a new batch of tests and reference products to continue my B study? So you can see that at the early lockdown stage, the main focus of the inquiries were received was how to rescue my B study when my study was interrupted by COVID-19. As opposed to the early lockdown stage, more recently, since most of the countries and regions in the world were reopened, but with social isolation and physical distancing guidelines, the inquiries we have received at this period shift the focus from rescuing their COVID-19 interrupted B study to how to prepare and conduct a successful B study during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has created massive disruptions to clinical trial research across the world, especially severely affecting the ability to conduct trials in a safe and effective manner. At this period, we have received multiple inquiries such as, can we conduct the B study in staggered groups to ensure the safety and minimize the risks of cross-infections between patient groups and between patients and clinical staff? Or during the planning for the B study to be conducted in the coming month, generic drug companies may foresee that it will be a tremendous challenge in patients recruiting, especially for a study that requires a longer duration and large sample size. Therefore, they may reach out to the agency and ask if they may manufacture a second batch of test product or using second or third reference batch to complete the study. If multiple studies, including in vitro and in vivo studies, are recommended for this product, a bridging study may be needed for any new test or new reference batch to be used. Therefore, it is always a good idea to submit your inquiry with sufficient details to acquire agencies' feedback ahead of time. Lastly, as generic drug industry adapts and reimagines the design and execution of the clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic, the idea of implementing decentralized clinical trial has become more and more popular. As of now, OGD has received a couple of such inquiries asking for additional guidelines for accepting a fully virtual or hybrid study as an alternative method of conducting the B study. We recommend that any generic drug applicants to carefully consider your study protocol, study methodology, and proposed testing approach in its entirety, and provide all these information in sufficient details to agency in order for a more informed feedback on a remote testing approach. The scientific inquiries sent to OGD that are related to COVID-19 typically come from these four sources: external email inquiry, control correspondences, and assessment, and pre-and meeting request. The external email inquiries were mostly received at the early stage of COVID-19 between March and June in 2020. More recent inquiries were sent to OGD through control correspondence pathways. Based on the topic of the issues, the inquiries will be addressed by Division of Filing Review, Office of Bioequivalence, Office of Research and Standards, or Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. We also received some COVID-19 related inquiries during the assessment process. Oftentimes, these questions were sent in through and general correspondences, sometimes through a post-complete response letter meeting request. We have also addressed multiple COVID-19 related inquiries via pre-and meeting request for complex generic drug products. These inquiries are typically addressed by Office of Research and Standards. In summary, no matter how your COVID-19 related inquiry is communicated to OGD, every and each discipline within OGD as well as offices outside of OGD are working together to ensure a timely response to these questions. Because our goal is to strive to help generic drug industry to avoid any preventable delays in generic drug development during COVID-19 pandemic. Based on the volume and the topic of the OGD received COVID-19 related inquiries, I have divided them in two common inquiry types. The first type is testing the RLD, the reference listed drug product availability issue. The other type is related to study protocol deviations. In the next two slides, I'll discuss these two types of inquiries in more details. For the first inquiry type, test and RLD availability, the most common question we have received is to ask whether they can use an expired RLD product to complete their B study. This is a very common question we received toward the early stage after COVID-19 outbreak. In general, we do not recommend conducting the bioequivalence studies using an expired reference product. The usage of an expired reference product lot for bioequivalence testing generally is not acceptable to determine bioequivalence. Another inquiry associated with this topic is to ask whether they may use 2 or more RLD batches at one B study. We understand that many studies may be halted due to COVID-19 interruption. When you resume your study, you may find that the previous RLD batch used is already expired. In this case, you may choose to acquire a new RLD batch to continue and complete the rest of the study. Similarly, you may experience that your test product batch will be expired due to the extended study period because of the COVID-19 interruption. In order to determine whether this is acceptable to use expired test batch in the remainder of the study, please submit your questions as well as the supporting information for agency's review. Test product batch substitution in vitro studies is another popular question. This situation is often caused by unexpected longer study duration because of COVID-19 interruption. So the test batch used in the in vitro studies may be expired when the time starts to conduct the in vivo studies. Therefore, some bridging studies may be required for any new test batch used in the in vivo studies. Oftentimes, it may significantly impact nasal and inhalation drug products, as both in vitro and in vivo B studies are recommended for these products. Lastly, we also encounter some questions related to whether they may use monocomponent RLD in lieu of the fixed combination RLD, or using authorized generic in lieu of the reference product in the B studies when there is an availability issue with the reference products due to COVID-19 interruptions of API supply chain. So on this slide, I'll talk about the second common type of OGD received COVID-19 inquiries, protocol deviations, which can be separated in 4 aspects related to AB study conduct. They are study design, study sampling scheme, study sample analysis, and statistical analysis. In the group of study design related inquiries, for example, we have seen questions of whether they may switch the study design from a 2-week crossover bioequivalence study to a parallel study, as it typically takes shorter time to complete. When the study subjects are already recruited, generic drug applicants may look into the ways to reduce the chance of study interruption by COVID-19, such as shorten the study period of time by changing the study design for eligible drug products. We also see questions of whether they may use a truncated area on the curve to assess the bioequivalence for their drug product. So they may shorten the study period and reduce the chance of interruption by COVID-19. Of course, as discussed earlier, many generic drug companies are interested in the acceptability of changing the B study design from a traditional in-person study to a fully virtual or hybrid study design. We've seen some questions asking agencies' concurrence on their proposed adaptive study design. There are also some applications stating that they had to delay their dosing in a particular period of study due to COVID-19 lockdown. So the second category, sampling scheme related inquiries, we have seen that for some study, patients did not turn up for last couple of sampling points due to lockdown or quarantine. They hope to see if the shortened sampling scheme may still capture an adequate pharmacokinetic profile for the study product. For sample analysis, we have discussed earlier that some inquiries are about the acceptability of the staggered dosing and bioanalysis for samples collected from a group of dosed participants. In an effort to preserve social distancing, the bioanalysis lab, in general, this approach may be acceptable. The generic applicant should ensure they establish and implement policy and procedures to describe the approaches and controls to be used to ensure the reliability of the statistical analysis and to maintain the study blind. Lately, we have seen some proposals to use model-informed approach to investigate the impact of missing PK samples due to COVID-19 restrictions on the analysis of the impact B study. Lastly, a couple of inquiries are related to interim statistical analysis plan. Although it is not ideal to add interim analysis that were not defined at the start of the trial due to unprecedented challenges caused by COVID-19, per FDA guidance on statistical considerations for clinical trials during COVID-19, it may be possible to revise the statistical analysis plan by adding a plan for interim analysis. By that, I hope I had given you a quick landscape of COVID-19 related challenges that generic drug industries are currently facing. In next couple of slides, I'll talk about how OGD is responding to COVID-19 and what is OGD's approach to support generic drug industry and help them conquer any unprecedented challenges caused by COVID-19. For any COVID-19 related inquiry, once received, OGD quickly triage it to appropriate discipline. If necessary, we'll have a bring everyone to the table discussion, which includes Office of Bioequivalence, Office of Research and Standards, Office of Generic Drug Policy, Office of Regulatory Operation, as well as OGD's partner office, Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, to ensure the industry's questions are addressed in the most efficient manner. There are three fundamental guiding principles for this process, which are scientific, consistent, and timely. What do they all mean? OGD recognizes the importance of the timely assessment of generic drugs that are used to treat COVID-19 or its symptoms. And OGD is aiming to promptly respond to all COVID-19 related inquiries, as OGD's ultimate goal is to support generic drug industry in the continued development of generic drug products during COVID-19 pandemic. OGD understands the challenges for generic drug development posed by the COVID-19 public health emergency, and OGD supports flexibility. For example, a generic applicant may choose to propose an alternative approaches to demonstrate equivalence between its product and the RLD product. Lastly, I want to emphasize that there are multiple different pathways that you may use to communicate your questions on interrupted B studies to OGD. If you have an ANDA that's already submitted to FDA, please reach out to the regulatory project manager for your ANDA, and they'll direct you to the appropriate pathways to submit your questions. If you haven't submitted an ANDA to OGD, please submit your specific questions via controlled correspondence pathway, or if applicable, the pre-ANDA meeting request pathway. You may also use OGD's generic drugs mailbox to submit any general questions related to the impact of COVID-19 on your B study. To summarize, OGD recognizes that COVID-19 pandemic has posed many unprecedented challenges to generic drug industry. OGD follows a multidisciplinary approach to timely respond to the inquiries in a consistent manner. Please identify appropriate regulatory pathway to submit your questions of COVID-19 impact on your bioequivalence studies to OGD. Okay, with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation today. For folks who are interested in CE credits, I have two challenge questions for you. Question number one, which source or sources do OGD receive COVID-19 scientific inquiries from? A, external email inquiry. B, controlled correspondence. C, ANDA general correspondence. D, pre-and a meeting request? E, all of the above. Yes, the answer is E, all of the above. Second question. Which routes from below may you submit your questions on interrupted bioequivalence studies during the COVID-19 pandemic? A, submit your questions to the regulatory project manager for your ANDA. B, submit your questions to genericdrugs@fda.hhs.gov mailbox. C, send your questions via control correspondence. D, send your questions via pre-and meeting request. E, all of the above. Yes, the answer is E again, all of the above. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please stay healthy and safe.